There's more optimism this morning on Australia's efforts to limit the spread of coronavirus. For the first time since the pandemic began, there have been no new reported cases in a 24-hour period in Australia's worst affected state, New South Wales. The news comes while there are more announcements about restrictions gradually being lifted in different states and territories. So while there have been close to 100 deaths here in Australia, and any death is very sad, there's this growing sense of hope about a managed transition back to some form of normality. The economic cost will be outlined by the Treasurer later today, with many people still hurting badly after losing their jobs. So here are today's key developments in our coronavirus coverage. The government is predicting 250,000 jobs could return within weeks as the country slowly eases restrictions. In 3 hours' time, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg will outline the full economic impact of the pandemic. In Victoria, face-to-face classes will resume for the youngest and oldest students in 2 weeks. All other pupils will return in a month. Children of essential workers can still attend classes. The aged care sector has drawn up a new code to govern visits to residential care homes. The aim is to create a nationally consistent approach. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ended the nationwide lockdown, saying his country must get back to work. But Russia has the third highest number of cases in the world, with 221,000 infections and more than 1,800 deaths. In France, people are able to walk outside for the first time in 8 weeks without a permit. Selected businesses have also reopened. Many hairdressers opened their doors seconds after midnight for customers desperate for a trim. And the AFL will soon announce plans to resume the 2020 season. A number of obstacles have been cleared, but plenty still remain before a ball can be bounced. OK, so let's take a look at some of those elements in detail now. Firstly, this very promising news out of New South Wales just in the last hour or so. Reporter Lara Hyams joins us now from Sydney. Lara, g'day. So really good news this morning, huh?
Welcome news for New South Wales, Joe. We didn't know that these figures were going to come about until the Premier gave her daily briefing at 8 o'clock this morning. Of course, this is the first time that New South Wales has recorded 0 cases of coronavirus since the pandemic actually began more than 100 days ago, when we saw those 4 cases actually come about in Sydney. So some welcome news. Some of the success has been attributed to some of the strict lockdown measures that were imposed by the New South Wales government, and also the increased testing that has become available. We know that with this particular figure, there were 6,000 tests that were carried out in the last 24 hours. The government has had a goal to make that about 8,000 tests consistently, and sometimes later in the week we've seen some of those testing, those figures actually fluctuate with an increase in that. We have heard as well as from the Deputy Health Officer this morning of New South Wales, who said there shouldn't be a spirit of complacency around this. People do need to observe those social distancing measures and increase their desire to go and get tested.
It's really pleasing to see we had no new cases reported to the 24 hours to 8 o'clock last evening, which is great news. But we know that the virus will be bubbling around beneath the surface in the community. So it's very important that we don't get complacent, that testing is really the key. We need to find every person who may have infection, and we can only do that by people coming forward for testing.
And Lara, the premiers and chief ministers are still urging people to stick by those rules as restrictions are eased.
Well, we had the 3 of them, the premiers of Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, appear on the Q&A program last night, the ABC's chat program, and there was somewhat a unity amongst those leaders, even though they were from different positions of the political divide. A couple of things. They were saying that people do need to remain vigilant in the fight to continue to curtail the spread of coronavirus, particularly focusing on social distancing as some of these restrictions do become ease. We know that with Victoria tonight, they're going to introduce some of those restrictions, or the easing of those restrictions, where you can go to a person's house and there can be 5 of you at one time. Politics really was put aside last night, and some of the other areas and themes that were touched upon was the spirit of unity, as we did see leaders from all around the nation working together through the National Cabinet. That was highlighted by the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, and also ways of how we can kickstart about the economy, particularly in New South Wales. There was discussion surrounding the reforming of payroll tax and also the scrapping of stamp duty. But the one thing that really emanated from that is that the leaders were keen to unify on the issue that if coronavirus outbreaks did appear again in the community, they weren't afraid to reintroduce some of those tough lockdown measures.
Right off the top, I made it clear to you I didn't enjoy looking at footage of people wandering around shopping centres, potentially buying things that they didn't need. This is not over. There's a long way to run. Look, if I got advice from our Chief Health Officer and if Brendan Murphy, as the Chief Medical Officer of the Commonwealth, felt that we no longer had control, that things had got to a point where we were going to see a really significant spike in cases and our hospital system fundamentally overrun, then of course we would have to reintroduce some of these sanctions.
Let's be clear though, are you prepared to go back into lockdown if there are significant outbreaks again?
Well, obviously if there are significant outbreaks, but we're hoping that's not the case. So our strategy moving forward is really to find that healthy balance, the new normal, whereby we have a manageable number of cases, but yet we're able to fire up our economy.
So from tonight in Victoria, up to 5 people will be able to visit the home of another person. There'll also be permission for 10 people, up to 10 people, to conduct outdoor gatherings. That is also going to be the same in New South Wales from this weekend, and similar measures being in place for Queensland.
OK, Lara Hyams reporting there from Sydney. Now, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg says state economies could lose hundreds of millions of dollars a week if harsh restrictions need to be reimposed. Parliament is sitting again for the first time in a month, and the Treasurer will give a speech outlining the toll the coronavirus is having on the nation's economy. Political reporter Nour Haydar joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Nour, g'day. So the Treasurer is expected to paint a pretty sobering picture of the economy.
Yeah, Joe, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg was due to deliver the federal budget today. That's a budget that the government only a couple of months ago thought would reveal a surplus, but that has been postponed until October, and instead Josh Frydenberg will be delivering, I guess, a less formal, less detailed speech to Parliament about the state of the economy and the impact that the coronavirus is having. He will reveal Treasury analysis showing that the key indicator or the key main driver of the recovery going forward will be increased retail sales, followed by the return of schools and parents going back to work. But in order for improvements to the economy to be sustained, Australians must continue to adhere to physical distancing measures and hygiene practices that have been talked about over the past few weeks. He says that a state like New South Wales stands to lose $1.4 billion a week if tough restrictions have to be reimposed. Somewhere like Queensland will lose $800 million a week if those tough measures have to be put back in place. Now, once all 3 stages of the government's COVID safe plan have been put in place, the government is expecting GDP to grow by $9.4 billion a month, and 850,000 people will be back in work. Now, the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, was on News Breakfast this morning, and he's defended the government against suggestions that it's rushing to reopen the economy to the detriment of public health.
You can't just see this as a binary trade-off, that it's the economy or health. COVID-19 is not the only health-related factor, and we need to have a healthy country, which means people are in jobs, children are in schools, people are earning incomes and contributing to society, because that's what ends up funding our health system and all of the other things that make Australia one of the best places in the world to live. So yes, we've got to get a balance right to make sure that the way in which we ease restrictions don't create a spike in COVID-19 cases, and that's why we're stepping through several gradual stages.
And Nour, the JobKeeper program is probably the biggest announcement the government has had through this coronavirus pandemic. That's where it was giving basically a wage subsidy of $1,500 a fortnight to people who'd lost their job because of the pandemic. What's the discussion around that at the moment?
Well, Joe, there has been a degree of bipartisanship that has existed throughout the crisis so far, but Labor has been out this morning insisting that the government needs to show a plan for the economy going forward. Now, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, is expected to tell the Parliament that there is no money tree, indicating that the federal government is very wary of spending more than it needs to because of this pandemic. But Labor holds concerns about the JobKeeper program. It wants to see more casuals included under that scheme. It says that the scheme has been bungled because some people stand to miss out entirely, whilst others will be receiving more money under that scheme than they otherwise would have earned during this period. Now, Labor also has concerns about the job seeker payment being wound back to $40 a day come September, as is the government's current plan. So we heard from the opposition leader Anthony Albanese this morning. He was on RN, and he's sceptical of there being a snapback in the economy as has been described by the federal government. He says financial support can't be stripped overnight, and there needs to be a gradual transition away from these measures.
There's an excuse for putting off the budget. There's no excuse for putting off a plan. And this government didn't have an economic plan last year. They doubled the debt. Productivity was going backwards, consumer demand falling. We had interest rates to record lows to try and boost the economy. We had underemployment going up. We had business investment in decline. And they don't seem to have be offering a plan now either.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin wants his country to get back to work despite the number of coronavirus infections continuing to rise. President Putin has called on the regions to ease restrictions and says construction, agriculture and energy sectors should be the first to reopen. Russia has registered its highest daily increase in cases and is now the fourth most affected country in the world by number of infections. India has reported its largest daily increase in coronavirus cases since the outbreak began. More than 4,200 new cases have been detected just in the past day, taking the country's total to more than 67,000. The increase comes as India's vast rail network, which transports more than 8 billion passengers a year, begins gradually resuming service. Passengers must wear masks and pass health screenings before being allowed to board, and trains will make fewer stops than usual. US President Donald Trump insists his administration is in control as coronavirus cases appear in the White House. Staff in the West Wing are being directed to wear face masks at work after an aide to the Vice President, Mike Pence, tested positive. Here's North America correspondent James Glenday.
Well, Donald Trump has come out today talking about ramping up testing across the United States, and that is something that is actually happening in a number of places as the backlog of needed testing is finally filled in a couple of key places. And Mr. Trump has been saying that the United States is now testing more than anywhere else, but of course it's worth noting that America also has more confirmed coronavirus cases than anywhere else. So that stands to reason. It also has more deaths recorded and confirmed from the coronavirus than anywhere else as well. One interesting thing is that a couple of changes have been implemented inside the White House over the past couple of days as a result of two members of the West Wing contracting the disease. Staffers are now being told to wear face masks unless they're at their desk, and it's been kind of interesting over the past day or so to see a lot more people heading into the White House with their faces covered, though that is actually pretty common now here in Washington DC. This press conference is the first formal one he's done in a couple of days, giving an update about what's taking place. We are hearing from the president. He's certainly not being quiet. We're hearing from him on Twitter every single day of the weekend. He was promoting a couple of conspiracy theories and also attacking his opponents and also attacking the media, which is kind of fairly par for the course for the president. So we're certainly still hearing from him, but there has certainly also being a change in strategy from the White House. He isn't as often subjecting himself to those marathon an hour and a half long press conferences where he was asked all manner of questions. So I think this one this morning could be quite interesting when he's asked about the outbreak inside his own executive offices, because reportedly, and a number of US media outlets are reporting this, Donald Trump has asked that no one who hasn't been tested be allowed anywhere near him.
James Glenday there. France has cautiously begun to lift its lockdown with millions back to work after 8 weeks of restrictions. Shops have reopened, students are returning to primary schools and people can leave home without a permit. But some parts of the country, including Paris, remain under tighter controls, with the country split into green and red zones. The World Health Organization has again cautioned against lifting restrictions too soon. Many countries are beginning to ease lockdowns, but some, such as South Korea and Germany, have seen jumps in new cases following the changes.
We saw signs of the challenges that may lie ahead. In the Republic of Korea, bars and clubs were shut as a confirmed case led to many contacts being traced. In Wuhan, China, the first cluster of cases since their lockdown was lifted was identified. Germany has also reported an increase in cases since an easing of restrictions. Fortunately, all 3 countries have systems in place to detect and respond to a resurgence in cases. Early serological studies reflect that a relatively low percentage of the population has antibodies to COVID-19, which means most of the population is still susceptible to the virus. WHO is working closely with governments to ensure that key public health measures remain in place to deal with the challenge of lifting lockdowns. Until there is a vaccine, the comprehensive package of measures is our most effective set of tools